Huge thanks to Laurie for doing this. I know it's a really popular topic, so I'm going to hand over to her.
Everyone that doesn't know me, my name's Laurie. So I'm one of the HKD Transition committee members, and I live in Hurstpierpoint, and I work as an ecologist. So I'm a freelance ecologist, and I've kind of prepared a bit of a talk which I'm calling Wilding Our Villages, which I hope will be of interest. It's been really heartening to see how many people have been noticing and being grateful for wildlife in what has been a very challenging year, and certainly a kind of renewed vigour for wildlife during 2020. So it seemed like a good opportunity to talk about maybe how we could do more to wild our villages of Hurstpierpoint, Hassocks, Kemah, Ditchling, and maybe villages beyond. I don't want to get too bogged down into semantics, but I'm going to start with sort of running through a little bit about what the words rewilding or wilding mean to me. They're quite sort of current terms, and within that really to sort of set the scene of maybe where we are and how we got to where we are. I've got a few thoughts then about maybe how we can wild our villages. It's not a finite list, but I hope really more than anything it will maybe just give you some ideas about things that you could take individual responsibility for yourself, as well as maybe things that we could perhaps do as a community. And it's really, I guess, sort of opening up a conversation rather than having all the answers. I'm not sort of professing to have all of the answers here, but really just things that we could perhaps think about as future projects to invite wildlife back into our lives. So I'm going to start with a very odd slide here. I always have lots of fun when I'm pulling slides together, and I think it's a real insight, probably quite a scary insight into my mind for other people. So this isn't my grandfather, but my grandfather was a coal miner. I didn't know my grandfather as a boy. I don't remember my grandfather as a young man. I didn't know his face before the markers of stress and toil, love and laughter. I don't remember him in the time before a stroke numbed one of his sides. This is a really weird analogy, I know, but I want to start really with this idea of a shifting baseline and shifting baseline syndrome. So something that you might have heard of before. So the landscape that I see around me, my normal, is hugely degraded when compared to that my grandfather would have seen around him when he was my age. And of course, the landscape that he saw around him when he was my age would also have seemed depauperate when compared to that of his grandmother. We do live in a wounded landscape, and this is not a problem, only a problem in itself, but actually, if we don't acknowledge this fact, I think it can really curb our kind of ambition and our expectation for the future and for conservation. So our landscape was once filled with megafauna, basically massive, huge mammals, much bigger than these guys. They were the creators of disturbance. They drove a patchwork of habitats, so swathes of open grasslands, woody habitats, woodlands. And then in turn, there was this fantastic array of large carnivores, some of which are still with us, that would have kept them moving, as well as the changing seasons and weather, the availability of food, all sorts of different things. It was really sort of a system, a community in flux. And many of these megafauna started to go extinct, actually maybe longer ago than you would have thought, so around 130,000 years ago. And the evidence suggests that even at that time, the cause was overwhelmingly man-made. It was exacerbated for some species by climatic change, but the link really seems to be to us. So it seems that we have been making our presence felt for quite some time. So in the past few hundred years, we've seen the rise of more organised agriculture, speeding up our impact ecosystems as we drained wetlands, we contained rivers, sort of stole away their energy while we could and straightened them and banked them, we enclosed fields, and we made really quite sweeping judgments about what species were or were not desirable to be sharing space with. And of course, we also increased urbanisation and all of the things that come along with that. And the results of this, one of the awards that I think that we would least want to win as a country. So according to the 2016 State of Nature report, the UK is among the most nature depleted countries in the world, which is horrible. It's thought that 1 in every 10 UK species could be facing extinction. So once common species like water voles are classified as endangered. And in fact, thinking about mammals more widely, and this is a global statistic here, but wild mammals now make up only 4% of mammals globally, which is quite shocking. So 36% is us, and the remaining 60% is our livestock. So we know we've lost about 97% of our species-rich grassland since the 1950s. If you prefer the area, that's around 3 million hectares, which is 1.5 times the size of Wales. So it's hardly a surprise then that there's been something between a sort of 60 and 75% decline in insects since the sort of 1950s and 60s. We also have just tiny fragments of our temperate rainforest remaining in the UK. It's a habitat that people don't even really necessarily realise we have, and it's nearly all now confined to steep-sided slopes in the west. So as far as I'm concerned, this sucks. It's hard to hear and it's hard to read, but I think, like I said, it's really important to acknowledge and to accept it, that it's happened, if we're to realise the ambition that we need to reach in terms of ecological restoration. So this is why I wanted to sort of bring in this idea of shifting baseline. So let's talk a little bit about rewilding or wilding. So rewilding is about expanding and relinking habitat, so returning naturally functioning ecosystems. It's about reconnecting ourselves with nature, and I think importantly it's about reframing our attitude to the natural environment as well. It's large scale, it's minimum intervention over the long term, and the aim really is to restore ecosystems by restoring natural processes, and it's these natural processes that are driving the outcomes that you see. So there's two kind of key processes that are at play when we kind of talk about rewilding. There are other natural processes, but the two kind of key things that we'll think about are succession. So this is the change in vegetation structure over time. It's not a static process. You have these pioneer plants that come in on sort of bare ground, and then over time the structure, the vegetation structure will change. It may become increasingly more complex as these pioneer plants make way for other species, but eventually the vegetation community reaches this stable climax community. And this would remain fixed in time if we were in a vacuum, but we're not. There's plenty of natural disturbance in this system. So this is this other process that's fighting back against succession. So there are fires, there are floods, there are storms, and there are very hungry mouths. And it's these natural processes that are sort of fighting against each other, but also working together to sort of shape vegetation structure. And it's the vegetation structure and composition that determines the wildlife that you get and the ecological function that you have. So we've lost a lot of these kind of drivers of natural disturbance, but there are proxies that we can use to create these sort of dynamic layers of vegetation. And these are the things that are at the heart of many of the rewilding or large-scale naturalistic grazing restoration projects, that's a mouthful, that you've undoubtedly heard about. And it's this sort of battle of vegetation succession and natural disturbance that creates this very dynamic kaleidoscope of habitat. And it's also sort of helping us to better understand the process of regeneration and how ecosystem restoration can work. So from habitat diversity springs species diversity, and with functioning ecosystems you have healthier processes, so things like healthier soils that can help to capture and store organic carbon. So in order to support the interacting herds that drive this type of restoration, you do need a large area of land. And the larger the scale, the better opportunity there is to support these ecological processes. So there would have been processes like seasonal foraging, migration. You would need sort of socially dynamic herds, and there would have been interspecies interactions. And then when we start thinking of these now absent predators like these beautiful lynx, they would have required a territory of somewhere between 2,000 and 45,000 hectares. So thinking of our 3 parishes, that's about 1 pair of lynx. So that's a little bit of the sort of background to rewilding as a kind of big landscape scale thinking. But whether or not you own a landscape or are simply part of a landscape scale conservation and ecosystem recovery is really, really essential. And these large scale rewilding projects, as well as important sites like our nature reserves and other protected sites, can't keep drifting like islands. We need to connect them up with one another. So we need to take actions across the countryside. So particularly when we think about the threat of the changing climate, and perhaps some of you came along to the talk that I did earlier in the year, and you'll have heard some of the threats that the changing climate poses to species, and the fact that many species will need to move in order to adapt and become more resilient to the demands of a changing climate. So even big projects, big nature reserves, protected spaces, they all need bridges between them. They can't just be these kind of islands in isolation. I think it's really great that rewilding has captured people's imaginations. It is something that does need scale. Like I said, there are these very big processes at play. So when you start to think about smaller scale, smaller size sites, there becomes more requirement actually for more close and sympathetic management. But you can base the sort of methods that you're using on mimicking natural processes. So for example, what we understand of the effects of these missing big herbivores, what effect they would have had on the landscape. So how might you do this? This could be things like the rotational hedgerow cutting to mimic the nibbling of an aurochs, perhaps shortcut and whisking away of grassland like a herd of tarpan, the kind of ancestral horses would have done, or ruffling up the ground like a reetling wild boar or Tamworth pig here that's searching for whatever tasty things might be under there. Perhaps it's ring barking a tree like a bark stripping red deer and creating that lovely deadwood habitat. So that's just a little bit of, I guess, a bit of a thought about rewilding, because I know it's sort of something that people are very interested in. I'm going to sort of go through a few kind of thoughts and ideas here about actually what can we do on a smaller scale. So what can we do in our own sort of patch? What can we do in our gardens? What can we do in our villages? And I suspect that a lot of what I'm going to tell you, I'm afraid won't be new to you or groundbreaking, I'm sure. But I hope that there are perhaps some details here that perhaps will help to explain or expand or justify some of these things. So thinking of gardens in particular, gardens apparently account for about 2 to 3% of the country's land cover. So how wonderful if we could make more space for wildlife in more of those gardens. So my first, I'm going to call it a recommendation, is to get rid of your lawn. Yep, get rid of it. Instead, why not nurture your meadow? So the reason why I say this, and the reason why it's my number one point, is it just feels so pertinent to me, because where I live, I don't have a garden, but I do look over somebody else's garden. I'm not going to tell you exactly where I live, because just in case that person's listening. But this garden is mown every week, every week. And every time I hear that mower start, I feel like weeping. There is so much potential in a grassland, in your lawn. So reducing cutting can really allow a whole range of flowering plants to come up and to thrive. You can cut later in the year and sweep away the cuttings to help these plants persist, but actually first give them a chance to thrive and to bloom. Because where there are flowers, there is food. Where there is food, there are foragers. So why not let things come up? Why not start by seeing what wants to grow, rather than what you want to grow, what you think should be there, and just let things grow. So I had a little play earlier. Sorry, it's a bit of an awful blurry map, but I just did a really quick mapping of some of the bees' nests that I found this year in Hurstpierpoint, and I've circled these because we know that our sort of smallest bees are likely to only forage around 250 metres from their nest. So if your house is within one of these blurry circles here, basically I need to tell you that there is a colony of hairy-footed flower bees, yellow-legged mining bees, red mason bees, or ashy mining bees relying on you for their foraging resources. So actually, hopefully, just it sort of demonstrates to you how important having these resources really sort of flowing freely through our landscapes are. So increasing the type of flowering plants that you have in your garden can be really beneficial. So there are some species that are really adept at infiltrating these very deep flowers, but actually lots of them need a much more sort of open flower, a sort of welcome landing pad. If they don't have nice long tongues like things like bumblebees do, or they're not strong enough to force their way into sort of deeper flowers. So families like the daisy family, the rose family, the carrot family, the mint family, the pea family, they're all great for different species of insects. And actually having a combination of these plants and having species that are going to be flowering early in the year, in the middle of the year, and right towards the end of year is really good. These aren't the only sort of plants, those families that I mentioned, but really if you can aim to have a combination of different species, different flower structures, different flowering times, that will be really, really beneficial. And do try and stick with our native wildflowers. Our wildflowers are really, really beautiful, and they're ours. If you are going to use sort of non-native or sort of horticultural varieties, do take the time to look for those with proven wildlife value rather than these kind of showy nothings that we do see a lot of. And relaxed cutting isn't just about flowers. So there's tall herbs, so this is flowering habitat and it's a really fantastic resource, but actually a lot of these tall herbs will have very woody stems, and these can be really crucial sheltering places for lots of invertebrates, and loads of different species will spend the winter tucked away in these little safe holds, and also just even within sort of grass stems and things. So without these sort of diversity of structure and these undisturbed habitats, we lose opportunities for species from butterflies like this little Essex skipper, to bumblebees, to toads, to bank voles. This structure is the sort of microhabitat that these species are looking for. And I couldn't find a very good picture, I'm afraid, to illustrate, but you're going to have to sort of bear with me. It's really a kind of concept. But I just want to kind of expand on that idea of microhabitat, because we can look at a picture like this, I guess quite a wintry scene that we're headed right for, and we could see here the grassland and the woodland, but actually it's not really about the grassland and the woodland, it's more about the areas in the front that are very short and sparsely vegetated, whilst at the back there's some low scrambling lazy scrub and some longer grassland that's kind of mingled in with it. And perhaps in there there's ash trees with sap runs facing in just the right direction, because actually just as you and just as I have our particular set of requirements, so does every other species. So these kind of microhabitats are really important, and the more sort of diversity you have within habitat, the more diversity of microhabitat that you can have. So we just need to kind of readjust the scale at which we look at the world, because I don't know if this is going to sound a bit odd, it made sense in my head I think, but what seems like a grassland to us from the height that we're at, if you like, will feel like a woodland to a beetle or a spider, if that makes sense. So thinking about woody habitats as well, these two would really benefit from less attention. So many of our woody shrubs don't produce flower on new growth. So actually, if we're kind of constantly cutting those back every single year, we're fundamentally affecting the volume of flowers that they are producing. And these flowers are a lifeline to invertebrates, so the sort of early part of the year when they're the first things flowering, and the fruits that come afterwards are a lifeline to migrating birds and other things as well, small mammals, all sorts of things. Me for my sloe gin. So there's lots of things that rely on our woody habitats, and perhaps actually going back to this idea of mimicking sort of natural processes, so natural disturbance from big herbivores, actually cutting rotationally rather than cutting back every year is more likely to do that. So I often see the advice to leave a messy corner in gardens, which is nice, but why not leave a sterile corner if you have to leave a corner in an otherwise living garden rather than the other way around? I know it can maybe feel more comfortable starting small, so okay, start small, but please aspire to add to it. You know, please aspire to let wildlife run through your garden, run through your life. I think we're very conditioned to sort of hyper tidy in our road verges, our parks, our magazines. Don't be afraid of a little bit of mess, because that's where the life is. So challenge yourself to see it not as mess, not as a micro, not as a horrible fungus resembling vomit, because that is its name, but as a fascination, not as a mess, but as a micro wilderness. So the next one I've got is, don't be afraid of death. There's as much life in a dead tree as there is in a living one, and actually many species rely on these death and decomposition habitats, and they're a real thing that we like to tidy away. We like to sort of sweep these kind of dead and decaying habitats away. Compost heaps, fallen leaves, rotting wood, even rotting reptiles, as you see here, are all important features. There will be something else that subsists on these, and they also return nutrients into the soil, so they're important sources of food and shelter, an important part of nutrient cycling. And if we can limit regular soil disturbances, we can also help soils to recover as well, and also their kind of constituent parts, so fungi and microorganisms to repair themselves. So we do need to stop seeing nature as something that is in the way to us, I think, you know, this us versus the environment. So I guess just even reminding yourself of that from time to time. If, like me, you can see the South Downs from your window, maybe take the time to look at it. Remember when you fill up your kettle that that's where your clean water's coming from. We have the natural environment to thank for our clean water, clean air, our food. And I think importantly this year, as we've all kind of really hopefully appreciated, those spaces to really feel that we can breathe and really unwind in. There are lots of barriers to break down, you know, unlocking the gates, quite literally our fences are barriers to wildlife. There's row after row of flower-free habitat, which can present a real sort of green desert. There's all the sort of chemicals that are swirling around as well. So there's lots of barriers that we can sort of start to break down. Another thing that can be a really important feature for wildlife is a pond. If you've got the space for that, it's a really fantastic resource. And wetlands, ponds, along with kind of woody habitats, can provide your very own sort of garden carbon sink. It's incredibly tempting to bring plants and animals into new ponds, but these things really can find their own way in remarkable time, particularly invertebrates and amphibians. So if you are introducing plants to a newly created pond, I cannot stress enough the importance of checking and checking again what they are and where they've come from, because it's still unimpressively easy to get hold of quite aggressive non-native species. So we can have a really big footprint, and kind of leading on for this idea of invasive non-native species, we can have a really big footprint outside of our gardens and our villages. And I think it is really important to be quite mindful of these things. So the impact of things such as peat, compost, the herbicides and pesticides that you use, the effect that they will have on other species. So, you know, do take the time to acquaint yourself with those things. I think another thing that's really important, which, going back to what I said at the beginning, I feel like a lot of people have been doing this year, which is fantastic, is actually taking the time to explore and to be thrilled. It's been really great fun seeing people out spotting nature and sharing what they're seeing with others. So we've got a sort of lovely Facebook page that's been set up this year by Trudy, and it's really nice seeing people engaging with that. So last year, this is a lovely yellow-legged mining bee here, and last year I remember being joined by a family whilst I was watching this bee colony. For anyone that lives in Hurstpierpoint, they live by the bus stop, and I've been watching them for a few years now, and it always amazes me how many people walk past without seeing this sort of wildlife spectacle. So there are always, you know, do take the time to look around you and to sort of see what's there. I spotted, well, not this particular one, but I spotted an elephant hawk moth caterpillar last year, and I feel if she's on the call, I should apologise to the lady who's I stopped walking with her son to show them. It was crawling along the pavement, because as I walked away and I was up the other end of the road, I could still see her trying to tear him away from this thing that he was absolutely fascinated with. So sorry, not sorry. So what can we do as a community? Is there a way that we could rebuild some of these broken strands between us? Like I said, I've just got a few kind of thoughts here, but it's not an exhaustive list, and perhaps other people have got other ideas, which would be great. So this is some of the data around some of the existing habitat that is in the area. So perhaps we could look at some of this data, look at the existing conditions, use some of our local knowledge to highlight what we've already got, what the priorities might be, but actually to look at where are the gaps, what could we do to link these areas up. Perhaps we know of particular species that are important within our communities. This is a terrible picture, but to my shame I don't have a better picture of beautiful house martins. So for example, in Hurstpierpoint there's still communities of house martins, there's still swifts that venture into our skies every summer. They're both species of conservation concern, and it is within our gift to help them. There's lots of ways that we could help them, and perhaps that as a community there are species like this that we could embrace and do what we can to really help them thrive. Perhaps there are opportunities to look at historical records. Maybe there are lost ponds, lost hedgerows, lost woodlands that we could look at reinstating. So you heard already in the report there from Charlotte that HKD has been involved with some natural flood management projects in Hassocks to slow the flow of water in the herring stream, and also creating a rain garden in Adastra, which is to demonstrate how absorbing the rainwater can be slowed and to help alleviate flooding risk within the village. maybe there are more of these opportunities to look at these natural solutions. There are lots of things happening locally, which is great. I know there's some small and dedicated groups working together, for example, on creating a landscape through which hedgehogs can safely roam. Perhaps there's a role in just getting people talking more, coordinating some of this action. Perhaps, like me, you've noticed, bit tongue-in-cheek here, what great road verges we have locally. Really, to me, they look like enormous snooker tables. How fantastic it would be to have those full of wildflowers. They're almost like ready-made corridors. Maybe that's something that we could work with our parish councils on. So hopefully, well, actually, you heard about the community orchard, in fact, in Ditchling, and hopefully some of you will know there is a newly planted one in Hurstpierpoint. It will be really interesting to learn more about the wildlife in them, and to make sure our communities are experiencing it. And that's something that HKD has been involved in with the Ditchling orchard, and hopefully we'll be able to do the same in Hurstpierpoint. Leading on from that, the Hurst Meadows, which some of you will hopefully be aware of, will hopefully be increasing their offer for wildlife. And it was really fantastic this year to see how many people embraced the request to stick to the footpath to protect the skylarks that were breeding there this year. So thank you very much for that. It was really fantastic to see those beautiful birds flying over the meadows. But can we be more ambitious still? There must be more that we can do. Hopefully some of you have got some ideas. So it's the small everyday experiences that foster our connection to the natural environment, and I think that help to build our long-term commitment to it. So instead of having these kind of knee-jerk reactions, which I do see from time to time, of what is it and what does it want from me? Actually, when you find a feisty beetle or you find a dazzling fungus, maybe take the time to get to know it, contemplate how wonderful it is that this thing has come into your life, and then tell someone about it. Tell your daughter, your grandson, your neighbour, tell the Facebook page. Share the joy, share the fascination and the appreciation, because we're going to need all of this and more to really turn this thing around. I'm going to finish with a really funny little story. I was very lucky last year to visit what felt like the beating heart of life itself, the Amazon. And actually, on my last day in the cloud forests above the Amazon, my travelling companions and I set up a little picnic overlooking an eternity of woodland. And as it happened, we were a little bit too close to an unseen wasp's nest. And I quickly earned the 3 most painful stings I've ever had in my life, so far at least. Did that ruin my trip, my experience, my perception of the place? It did not. It was a farewell meal to remember, and it reinforced what an amazing world this is, and that there are so many things worth fighting for, no matter how much they want to hurt you. So I hope that gave you something or some things to think about, and maybe you know, some things that you'd like to chip into a conversation. So yeah, I hope it maybe stimulated some thoughts, because hope is a very important word right now. Thank you very much, and I'll stop sharing my screen just now.
Thank you so much, Laurie. That was really, really interesting. I'm just going to give you a minute to look at what's in the chat, because there's quite a lot of stuff about verges before you even mention them. And Anne mentioned about the hedgehog project before you mentioned it. So that was really nice.
Anne was here. Oh, that's
Yeah,
lovely.
she's here. So I wondered, actually, I was going to pick on Kirsty just to give you a chance to look at what's in the chat, Laurie. I was going to pick on Kirsty as one of our county councillors, our West Sussex county councillors, just to talk about the project that West Sussex is starting about the verges, Kirsty, because that seems to have been an interesting thing for a number of people on the chat.
Yeah, I can just say a few words. So there are two things. West Sussex County Council has a pollinator strategy which they released last year. So that may be something that you'd be interested in looking at and just reading what it is that they're trying to do there. But I mentioned to the parish council last night, and I think Nick alluded to it. They're currently looking for communities to work with to try and plant wildflowers and encourage wildflowers to grow in the verges and just improve biodiversity rather than just sort of cutting the grass all the time. And so the parish, I'm passing the information on to the parish council, and they're going to contact West Sussex and see if it's something suitable to do in Hassocks. It may well be that anyone in Hurstpierpoint may want to contact the parish council in Hurst and suggest that they do similar. And then in Ditchling, we probably need to talk to Sarah Osborne, who's the county councillor over there, to see if East Sussex is doing anything similar. But it looks like they're starting to kind of try and, you know, do some of this work at a very localised level, which I think is good news.
Thanks very, very much, Kirsty. That's really positive. Anne, do you want to just briefly mention about the Hedgehog Project in case people don't know about it?
Myself, yes. You mean me?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm constantly on the battle of trying to get people to, you know, we did want to try this year and do some tracking of hedgehogs, partly in the new houses that are being built and also around Orchard Way. Unfortunately, COVID has kind of put the shambles on that one a little bit. But, you know, hopefully we can get to do that at some stage. I mean, this year I've actually, in Orchard Way, I've actually rehomed lots of hedgehogs this year in a couple of gardens down there, which has been really successful. And where I'm always sort of rescuing and Sorry, I missed that. I'm always rescuing and putting hedgehogs back, etc. So, you know, sometimes we get hedgehogs that can't go back to their original home because they were found in the middle of the road or somewhere weird, and so I'm often then re-putting them back into other people's gardens, and I'm always constantly on the thing of sort of creating hedgehog highways or generally wildlife highways and making sure people, if they've got ponds, that they're safe and all of those things. And I do lots of talks, as many of you have been to, and we were planning this year, again COVID has put the scuppers on that one, to have Kate Bradbury, who's talks about, she's well-known wildlife presenter, and she was going to come and talk to us, but hopefully we'll do that next spring, depending on COVID allowing, really. So that will be really brilliant if we can do that.
And just say the name of your project in case anybody doesn't know about it and wants to look it up.
Yes, so my project is Hurst Hedgehog Haven. So mainly what we do is the idea is that we create awareness as much as anything. And people, you know, a lot of the time have hedgehogs in their garden, but have no conception about them being in their garden. You know, they have no idea whatsoever, which is really funny. And so often I go to rescue hedgehogs. I've just been, and the reason I was late to the meeting is that I was actually rescuing one that didn't need rescuing in Burgess Hill. Enough. But anyway, it was fine. It turned out to be fine, but there was a lot of running around and trying to look and things, so it was all absolutely fine in the end. But we're Hurst Hedgehog Haven, and we've got quite a busy little Facebook page and a website, etc. And I'm lucky enough now to have 3 other ladies that help me with rescue, because we've got 15 hedgehogs at the moment in our care. So we're quite busy at the moment. So good job I'm not working.
So if anybody wants to find out about Anne's project, Hurst Hedgehog Haven, Laurie, have you had a chance to look at the comments now? I don't know if there's anything in the chat. I don't know if there's anything you want to respond to.
Well, I think most of it's sort of, it's mostly discussion about the verges, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Claire, your little patch sounds lovely that you've been talking about, and I think the way that you're managing it sounds great as well. The comments just come in. Oh yeah, yeah. I don't know if there's anything really to kind of add to that. I mean, clearly the verges are a big opportunity, and it would be really great to sort of maybe talk to Kirsty and others further about how we can sort of enhance those, because for me they kind of feel like dead space at the moment, which is a real shame. There's a real sort of opportunity there.
It would save the councils a fortune as well from mowing them constantly, which would be brilliant, wouldn't it?
Mm.
Can I just pick up on Juliet, the question that Juliet's just put in the chat? Juliet, do you want to speak to that a bit?
I was noted that Laurie was talking about the possibility of some kind of a mapping of sort of across the villages of existing habitats, and sort of looking at the gaps and what might be done to connect them up. I'm just wondering whether there might be people who would be interested in being part of that kind of mapping project.
It would be a really useful thing to do, I think. I mean, I know there has been some stuff done previously in West Pierpoint. I don't know about Hassocks or Ditchling, and there will be some very good data out there as a sort of starting point. But yeah, it would be good to kind of refine that. And parish mapping, sort of something that there's lots of guidance out there and help with how you can do that. So yeah, a couple of people have said they're interested, which is great. Thank you.
So if you are interested in that, it sounds like a really good opportunity. Some people are putting comments into the chat, so that's good. Can you make sure if you are adding a comment to the chat that you're interested? We would need to be able to follow up and contact you. So just make sure you drop, possibly the best thing to do would be to drop an email to info@hkdtransition.org.uk. You can go onto our website and just send us a message that way if you are interested. Laurie, you've got a question from Joe about books or resources.
Yeah, I mean, there is lots of information out there. Actually, I think fingers crossed in the next few weeks I'll get some stuff up on the HKD website. We're kind of just refreshing, I'm going to say, the website at the moment, and yeah, I'd quite like to put a little bit on there about sort of wildlife, not necessarily to kind of reinvent the wheel, because there's loads of great information out there, just more to kind of point out where it is to people to find. So yeah, I can watch this space.
And someone has just suggested, George has just suggested on the chat, Kate Bradbury's Wildlife Gardening for Everyone, which is published by the RHS. Oh, and Dave Goulson, who's a professor at Sussex with an interest in bees, has published something called The Garden Jungle.
Yeah, he's got several books. He's got some useful information on his blog as well.
And then there's another one, Gardening for Wildlife by Adrian Thomas, which is an RSPB publication. Yeah. So all of those sound good reads. Couple of other questions. Is there a seed swap planned for next year? Is Alistair still on the call?
Yes, I am. It kind of depends a little bit on whether the CD Sunday seed swap in Brighton happens, because that's where I get most of the seeds from. So I take a lot of the seeds that I save and then I swap with other people at CD Sunday to get a good variety, and that's kind of where we get our seed bank from. So if CD Sunday goes ahead, in whatever form, obviously it's going to be interesting to socially distance. I don't know whether anybody's ever been to CD Sunday, but it's like the least socially distanced event in the world. So if it goes ahead in some kind of format that allows us to go there and trade seeds, then it possibly could go ahead, and we might use this year's kind of model if we're still in the same situation in March next year. But so kind of watch this space. But if anybody does have a bunch of seeds or has a garden that at the moment they can harvest seeds, do harvest them and save them so that we can kind of keep the community resources of seeds going.
Thanks, Ali. I'm just noticing comments from Anne. There's a seed swap in a phone box in Burgess Hill. I love that. And George is working with Hurstpierpoint Parish Council and volunteering to take the Verges project forward with them. So that's great. Okay, any final questions for Laurie before I wind us up? No, okay. Absolutely delighted there's so much interest in Verges. We will pick that up. We'll put something into our, maybe into our next newsletter about it. If you're not on our mailing list, hopefully you all are, and that's why you're here. But if you're not on our mailing list, please do sign up. We get a fantastic newsletter once a month from Astrid, who puts that together. But you don't get deluged with lots of emails, so it's not like you're going to get something every day or even every week. You just get a really nice newsletter once a month with lots of useful information. So if you're not on our mailing list, please do sign up for that. You can do that by visiting our website. So if you just Google HKD Transition, you will you'll find us and you can sign up via our website. So I'm just going to conclude there by saying huge thanks to everyone for joining. So we had 41 computers and more than 41 people, because there's 2 of you on some screens. So really delighted with the turnout. Thank you so much for coming. And especially big thanks to Laurie, because that was a great talk, as lots of people are saying in the chat. Just finally to say, if you live in Hurstpierpoint and you're interested in getting involved in Hurst, Lucy and Charlotte are pulling together a group of people interested in that. And we've got a meeting on Zoom tomorrow night. So if you would like to join that, I'm trying to think of the best way to do that. Lucy, what's the best way for people to get in touch about that?
I'm just wondering if I can post the link to the Zoom now on the chat. Would that be useful?
Yeah, if you can do that quickly as we wind up, that would be brilliant. So there is in Hurst, sorry, we're going on a bit about Hurstpierpoint tonight, but normally it's all about Hassock, so I'm very proud as a Hurst resident. So
our time back.
Yes. So in the Hurst Festival, there was a great session that Alistair contributed to about building back better in Hurst. What can we do post-COVID? And as a result of that, a group is being set up to look at what we can do in Hurstpierpoint. So if you do live in Hurst and you'd like to join that Zoom meeting, I'm really flanneling now, Lucy.
Okay, it's coming.
It's coming, it's coming. There will be a link coming up. There you go. There's the link to the Zoom meeting. So do copy and paste that if you're interested. Otherwise, I think if you email us at info@, we will try and get back to you about it before the meeting tomorrow night. But otherwise, thank you so much, everybody, for joining. It was really, really good night. So thank you very much. And yeah, we'll see you again. Thanks a lot, guys. Bye.
Thank you.